you, and uh, thank you to BIZTEC for this conference, which I think is really fascinating. We've heard some really interesting things along the way this morning and along up to now. We now have a privilege of doing an hour of something that I think this group of people feels is very important. We are missing our colleague Jeff, whose bio you can see. And the reason is he's a Queen's Counsel, very important lawyer, indeed one of the best known litigators in Canada. And it just so happens that he has a court hearing as we speak, which, as we know with judges, sometimes you cannot get out of. But happily, we arrange for this contingency. So in a short minute, we will actually just have him on tape before we start with Yasmin and Laura. The basic thesis of this session is as follows. We believe, and I think all kinds of wonderful statistics would prove this out, that companies that practice good ethics, good governance, have strong and diverse management teams tend to do the best. That's true whether you are, Tariq's Rumi, a small non-NGO, a large corporation, or a large law firm, as Laura and I both come from, Jones Day, which has got about 45 offices around the world. And I think Yasmin's going to speak to this in detail, so I won't steal her thunder. But that's certainly Jeff's view, as you will see in the tape in a minute. The other thesis is that we have made a lot of good progress these last few decades, but as now President Biden said yesterday, we have a lot to work to in terms of a more perfect union. And I think that's kind of a thesis here, is that we've done a lot, but a lot needs to be done. And I think we have seen the limitations of some of what hasn't been achieved, including regrettably some of the race-related aspects, not least here in the US, but around the world. It is particularly distressing when you have, for example, a sporting event going on, which should be completely, colorblind, and the match stops because of, racial slurs from the stands of whether it's a football game or, help us, even a cricket game. But the third piece, which, and then I'll stop talking and we'll go to our panelists, is this. Historically, and we touched on this with Justice Aluch this morning, historically, companies have stuck with, at least in North America, the traditional view that their primary and indeed only interest is the maximization of profits for their shareholders. And that theme has begun to change. And, I'll just take one example. The Business Roundtable, which is the organization of most of the major companies in North America, came out with a statement now about 18 months ago, where for the first time in their long history, they conceded, if you will, that it's not just the primacy of shareholders, it's the interest of all the stakeholders. And who are the stakeholders? They are the employees, they're the customers, they're the communities that those organizations or those institutions or those companies work in. They are the environment at large. In other words, all those sort of rather obvious things which I think nobody would disagree with. Now, a number of organizations have signed on to this statement, and you will hear it discussed quite often, just as you will hear discussed the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, each one of them as acceptable as the saying goes, motherhood and apple pie. The real challenge is, of course, to see whether, in spite of the happy cosmetic talk, actual action is taking place. And that's really what this panel is going to talk about. Rather than attempt to introduce either Yasmin or Laura, perhaps each of you could just say a few words about who you are, what you do, and then we will start the more substantive piece of this. Yasmin?
Sure. My name is Yasmin Merali, and I am very involved in the diversity and inclusion space and have been for a number of years. My background is really varied. I was born in Tanzania in East Africa and subsequently lived in England for a bit and a long, long time in Canada. My background in terms of qualifications and education is really centered around strategy and business planning. I actually started off in corporate audit and subsequently moved into different roles, culminating in the work that I currently do, which is really centered on diversity and inclusion and helping organizations of all sizes, all contexts succeed in ensuring and embracing pluralism in the workspace. Over to you, Laura.
Hi, my name is Laura Tuell. I am the partner in charge of pro bono for Jones Day for all of our offices across the world, so both in the US and internationally. I grew up as a trial lawyer at the firm and became a partner in the trial practice. And a little over 10 years ago, our managing partner asked me to take over the firm's pro bono program full-time firm-wide. I remember we did it in his office. We were standing up. I was surprised, and I asked him if we could have a few moments to talk about what his goals and expectations were, as this was a new position being created. And he said, "No, I expect that you'll change the world and you'll impress me while you do it." And so apparently that is my job description. So that's what I do.
Well, and as we'll hear in a minute, which at least personally I'm so proud of, the Laura has taken the lead to indeed try to change the world in the small ways that one institution can, but of course, in collaboration with others, the effect is even greater. So I think what we had intended to do here, Bashir, was to have each person talk a little bit, and then obviously I'm going to pepper them with questions, but perhaps we can start with Jeffrey's 15-minute video that we did, and that's a good way to start this.
You can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, there we go. Then we can get the ball rolling.
Okay, Jeff, thank you for joining this panel. We really appreciate it. I think you and I are both members of very large national and international law firms with wide experience in many sectors of the economy and many types of legal and social problems. So I think that gives us a unique opportunity to have a discussion about how large institutions, and in this case, large companies, operate. So the basic thesis that I wished to discuss with you, and I hope you can comment on, is that my thesis is that companies that abide by good governance, ethical standards, the rule of law, and have diverse management and employee base tend to be the ones that succeed well. And I think the empirical evidence shows it. From your experience in advising large companies and perhaps being on the boards of some, how do you see that thesis?
So firstly, I think that is that's wise, and it's especially wise over the long term. I think what I would say, Javade, is that if you look at leaders in business who look over the long time horizon of themselves and the next generation of leaders, they know that looking at the ethics I mentioned, dishonesty may be profitable in the short run, but it's disastrous in the long run. And that has become ever more so because of the work of international lawyers who have passed a network of laws against corruption of foreign officers, legislation in Canada and elsewhere. In my own practice, I've seen that have a profound effect on international business, where businesses that had thrived on dishonest practices in bidding and obtaining contracts have now found that that was a short-term success. And so I'm optimistic, actually, that a international level of honesty, minimum honesty in contracts and contracting will drive more economic efficiency, and it will mean that businesses will succeed if they adhere to those levels of honesty and transparency.
No, that's certainly my own experience. How about, and I think I know you've spoken to me about this before, kind of the combination of good governance, ethics in general, beyond people, being engaged in corruption, and diversity in companies. What's been your experience with that?
Well, firstly, I think we're at a very unique moment again in this, in that there's a huge cry for progress. And so I think there's a huge opportunity to make the next generation of progress in these areas. I think the first thing that we can learn from the past is let's not pretend it's easy. I think there's a tendency rhetorically and otherwise to say, if everybody would just agree with me, we could wake up tomorrow morning and the world would be a better place. Progress is never that easy. If you look back over the last 40 years, progress has come in fits and starts. It's not always one direction. And so realizing that these things aren't easy, either because people can be challenging, but also the subject matters can be challenging. The example I give is the wave of it on the ethical side, the wave of law, which meant that public authorities had to accept the lowest bid, which was intended to drive out dishonesty in contracting. Well, it had the unintended effect of bankrupting vertical construction firms, because the law of the optimistic bidder basically meant that they eventually lost money because too many projects would have unexpected risks attached to them. And we've had to go through now 2 or 3 generations to try to cope with the fact that just being required to take the lowest bid has unintended negative economic consequences. I think the other examples I've given of things that aren't easy, which are more on the human rights side, I was phoned by the prison doctor in a prison saying that the prison had shut down their baby in prison program. Could I take action under our Canadian Constitution to reopen it? And I thought, well, that'll take me a few weeks. I'm sure the prison officials will see my way and see the way of the doctor, and we'll get that done quickly. So, 6 years later, in a 6-week trial with 20 expert witnesses, we ended up succeeding at the trial. But it wasn't as easy as I thought it would be. I was involved in the new Canadian Constitution in advocating in the courts for the rights of immigrants who were not yet citizens to hold jobs. And that right was not expressly protected in our new Constitution, which was just passed in 1982. And eventually we were able to persuade the Supreme Court of Canada that they ought to have similar rights because they had similar issues and needs to the other protected area peoples and groups under the Constitution. But that ended up being a 5-year battle and not a 2-week battle or a 3-week battle. So these things aren't easy. That's the first thing I would say. Secondly, I do think we have to remember how much progress we've made, and I would fight for this. I think the rhetoric often is, we shouldn't have to do this. Well, we do have to do this. Every generation has to advance itself, and also remember the history. I mean, we have made a huge amount of progress in this area. Look at the people I'm talking to. 40 years ago, we would be saying, geez, wouldn't it be nice to have a Mr. Chaudhri in the conversation? Wouldn't it be nice to have a Mrs. Chaudhri in the conversation? And we have a diversity of people in the conversation today that was really almost the subject of dreams 40, 50 years ago in my parents' generation. So there has been a lot of progress, and I think learning how we made that progress and celebrating that progress as well as taking on the next challenges is important.
No, I must agree with you completely, Jeff. Occasionally we can all be, pessimists about these things. One thing I wanted to ask you is that, in my years, both as a general counsel for about 15 years and then as a lawyer for private law firm, I have found that the pressures created by bad behavior has an effect. And so I also have known from my experience with investors who came to speak to us on various things, that if we demonstrated good ethics, and by the way, that was recognized by independent organizations, all that actually helped the perspective of the investment community. They wanted to invest in your company because they trusted the management. They trusted the management to be transparent. They trusted the management to say, yep, look, these are not easy issues, but we are working to fix them. What's your experience been, both north or south of the border?
Well, I'd say 2 things. Firstly, I think all progress eventually transforms culture. and culture is the real victory, right? I think I remember somebody telling me that when they went into a law firm, Javade, they could tell within the first 5 minutes what that law firm was like based upon how the receptionist greeted them, what the flavor of the firm was like. And that's just, we're culture understanding creatures. And that's true for people in the firm as well as outside the firm. It's true for people in companies and outside the companies. And it's the culture which drives behavior. It's the culture which puts incentives in front of people. It puts positive incentives and negative incentives. It's the culture that celebrates success, what kinds of success it celebrates. So from my perspective, I think we have to recognize that's the ultimate goal, is to transform culture. That's where we've made progress. The law can lead culture, it can shape culture, and so can internal policies. But I think if you recognize that we have to change culture, then I think we're on to the right thing. If you take your example, I think I'm going to translate it into a really practical economic things. If you can't trust the numbers, right?
Yes.
If you can't trust the numbers, then you don't know what you're doing. And in any modern world, you need to be able to trust the numbers. That's one of the great advantages North American businesses have. I think we have a more robust numbers than pretty much anywhere else. I think cultures have traditionally tended to tolerate uncertainty and vagueness in the numbers. And I think driving true, transparent, reliable numbers allows the market forces to work in their best way possible. And a culture that says we above all will produce accurate numbers is going to be in the long run more successful.
I think that's exactly right. I was going to note to pick up on your point that, there are companies where the management sits sort of in an ivory tower and not very well connected to the employee base. And I think that in my own experience, again, in-house or as an outside advisor, the management teams which collaborated very intimately with the various layers of employees, and where there were easy ways for people to put up their hand and raise issues, were the ones that succeeded the most. And the reason, of course, is that every institution, every organization has problems. And the trick is to identify them, be honest about them, and then proceed to fix them. And I imagine that's your experience.
So there's an example, I think, of being able to celebrate progress. If you look over the last 40 years, organizations have become flatter than they were before. The degree of pyramidical thinking 40
Yes.
years ago was extraordinary. The CEO was way, way away from everybody else. Now, partly as a result of transformations in technology, transformations in the culture driven by technology companies, a CEO can't afford to be that. And I think that's positive. But coming back to your point, businesses that are effective are businesses where the distance between leaders and others in the company is smaller, and that the barriers to communication are lower. One thing I would say about transforming culture for those of us who are interested in making the next steps in respects of ethics and diversity and caring for others is to recruit CEOs and people in leadership effectively. In other words, recruit allies rather than enemies. And I think there are people wanting to be allies who are a bit fearful of walking into the room and not getting the language right, not expressing the right ideas. And I think we have to be generous with one another in business. I think we have to say we have a common cause in these things. We have a common hope for progress, and we have a common hope for changing in our culture that's going to be positive and enable the businesses and organizations to thrive and prosper. If we're not commonly pursuing a goal where the organization as a whole is prosperous and thriving and a good place to work and live, then I think we're not going to be as successful as otherwise.
I couldn't agree more. I would say that this point that you make about culture is so important and so profound. And, I suppose in some ways I would say that North American companies, maybe I'm less familiar with some European companies, for example, but have done a reasonably good job with that. So if you look at some of the household names around North America, those companies often have CEOs with names like yours and mine, meaning they aren't necessarily from the traditional sort of landed gentry. What's your experience with companies in other parts of the world?
Well, I think the cultures are quite specific. I think countries in other parts of the world have lower diversity in part because the people they draw from have lower diversity. If you go to Africa, most people in the company are Africans, and in parts of Africa, although Africa, as you know, is a astonishingly diverse continent with 54 countries, so you shouldn't speak about it as one sort of monolithic culture. But I think there's less diversity. I think what we have to recognize is that North America is sort of an unusual place, because this is a place, and I say this of Canada, where everybody has arrived from somewhere else, whether it was one generation ago or many generations ago. And so we should remember when we're dealing with the rest of the world that it's not uncommon to find that there's less diversity in the sense of businesses and organizations because they've come through generations of it. Having said that, usually when you lift up the appearances, you find underneath a hugely greater amount of diversity than you would have otherwise thought, because you just don't get it because you're seeing it from a distance. So I think it's a common experience of humanity that essentially what happens is people have a tension between grouping amongst people that they feel comfortable with, either because they share a race, a religion, a culture, or otherwise, and then benefiting from the fact that if they cross the bridges and they connect with the skills of other cultures and other races and other genders, that collectively that's a more creative, collaborative, innovative organization. So those two tensions, I think, are a healthy tension, but we have to recognize that human social animals, our default is actually not to be diverse. Our default is actually to be more comfortable with people who look and feel like us. But the positive feature is I think we're more productive if we get together across those barriers.
No, quite right. I have to say that you have used the 40 years expression a couple of times. I'm now in my 40th year as a lawyer, and I would agree with you that we have a ways to go, but so much progress in those 4 decades for which we can be grateful, and it is part of the unique, diverse culture of North America. But I'm going to switch and ask you one final, very important question to which you do not have to answer, which is, we know your father was a great fast bowler. For those of you listening, that's cricket, by the way. Are you able to do anything along the same lines?
No, I can only watch cricket with unclear understanding, but admiration from a distance. But I can pretend to, at one point, be able to hit a baseball.
Well, let me ask you the final sort of subset then. If we were to go to a cricket match together, and I said that was a dusra, a tisra, a googly, would you know what I was talking about?
I get the googly, because once having heard what a googly is, one never forgets it.
Yes, actually, dusras and tisras are variations on a theme. And I think with that, we can turn this back to Bashir, who actually is a real cricketer. Okay.
All right. Enough about my cricket. Take it away, sir.
Okay. Bashir, your screen has got a black smudge on it. That was great with Jeff. And I think a couple of the themes that I want to pick up with Laura and Yasmin are really exactly along the point of culture. But let me start with you, Laura. Laura and I are, by the way, almost neighbors in the office in Washington of Jones Day. And, I'm a bit player in this exercise, but I see Laura managing and organizing what we lawyers call pro bono activities all over the world. But there are two that I think would be particularly useful, Laura, to sort of convey how our big law firm can do some really useful things, especially in collaboration with some of our clients who are similarly inclined. And so but obviously this is your show now, but I thought it would be particularly useful to talk about our work on behalf of refugees and asylum seekers. Well, let's start with that.
Sure, thanks, Javade. As we've thought about our pro bono work at the firm, we think about ways that we can bring the talents and resources of our lawyers across the firm, the resources that the firm has to address significant challenges. And we think about that not just in what we have, but what we can bring from our corporate clients, nonprofit organization partners, and others in an effort to work towards systemic change. And so in 2014, when the unaccompanied children's crisis started in the US, we had a call to action from our managing partner to try to assist those children. And we jumped in and we went straight to the military bases where the children were being held. We transitioned our work then to assisting with the first family detention facility that was opened in Artesia, New Mexico. And we continued to do work for unaccompanied kids for a while. In 2017, our managing partner came to us and said that that was lovely, but not good enough. And he really wanted to, instead of taking a bunch of small cases here and there, he really wanted us to think about a transformative project that we could do that really more systemically addressed the issues. And so we spent some time thinking about what the unmet needs were within the immigrant community in the US. And one of the most significant are detention centers where migrants are held that are in often remote locations where there are no free legal services. And so migrants are processed and they never get a chance to talk to a lawyer or even hear what their rights are. And so we looked for a location and found a detention center in Laredo, Texas, that really met the needs that we were looking for. It held all women at the time, and most of them were from Central America. And so we'd already been dealing with moms and kids from Central America, so we knew the gender issues and the gang issues very well, and it was all one language. It was almost all Spanish, with some indigenous language in there, but mostly it was all Spanish. And so it was women in an area that we were really concerned about with asylum and withholding of removal, so real true refugee issues. It was in a remote location and there were literally zero free legal services. So when we first went in, we met a couple women who already had a lawyer because they'd been transferred from another facility, and we asked them if there were other women there that might want a lawyer and how we could start to interact with them. We needed to know their names and their alien identification numbers. You can't just walk into a detention center and say, hey, we want to meet with people. And so we asked them to go back and ask the other detainees if anyone would like to see a lawyer. They came back to us with literally hundreds of little pieces of paper torn up with names and A numbers, and they just poured them out on the table for us and said, all of these women need a lawyer. And so we immediately realized that there was a huge unmet need for services, and we started that week. We were on an exploratory mission. We took on cases because we never do anything halfway. So we didn't have an office. We didn't have anything set up yet, but we started taking cases right away. And we set up an office in a hotel right on the river of the Rio Grande, separating the United States from Mexico. And we flew in lawyers from our offices across the US and from our Mexico City office, and they came in every week and went into the detention center and met with women who were detained there. We talked with them about their rights, about their particular cases, gave them information and advice, and then we took on several hundred cases for full representation. If they were tried in detention, we tried them there. If they were released from detention, we followed them wherever they went. There are several corporate clients that joined us in that mission. They would send their corporate in-house counsel down to spend a week with us on the ground. And there's no better way to get to know each other than to roll up your sleeves and spend a day in a detention center. At night, we would have dinner together and talk through all the cases that we had seen for the day, answer questions, and provide mentoring and support. In the summer of 2019, the US government changed its policies and required that the vast majority of immigrants from Central America remain in Mexico while they're waiting for their immigration proceedings, rather than coming into the United States to either be detained or released on parole or some other type of humanitarian relief. And so our client base, instead of being in the detention center in Laredo, we're now in Mexico, just across the border in Nuevo Laredo. That required a huge pivot for us to change our delivery of legal services. And so we set up a system to work with those migrants while they were in Mexico. And so we had to talk with them by cell phone. Instead of being able to meet with them in person, the trial team that tried their cases would meet them the day of the trial for 20 minutes before trial started. And all of their other prior communications would have been by cell phone. The trials were in tent courts that were set up right on the border. And so the migrants would stay in Mexico. They would spend the night on the bridge and then walk across the bridge at 4:30 in the morning, get processed, and then come into these big tents for their scheduling hearings, and then their individual hearings were held in shipping containers. The judges were remote, so they were by video from either San Antonio or Fort Worth, and our lawyers would sit in the room with our clients. Many of our clients.
Laura, let me just interrupt to just make sure people understand. This was part of kind of our law firm's culture to be helping. Obviously, this is a purely pro bono basis. How many lawyers did you eventually have involved? Because I've heard the numbers in the hundreds, really, weren't they? Between our own lawyers and our client lawyers.
Right, we had, depending on how you count it, we had probably upwards of about 1,000 lawyers that came in at different times. That would include summer associates, lawyers from our domestic offices, a few of our lawyers from some international offices, and many of our lawyers from our Mexico City office participated in one way or the other. So either they took cases once the clients were released, if they had trials across the United States, or they actually came into Laredo and did work on the ground in Laredo. And this includes also lawyers from all of our different practice areas, because you don't have to be a litigator to do client interviews and assessments of the cases. And so we had lawyers from all of our different practice groups, from banking and tax and corporate transactional. All of them would come down and spend time with us on the border.
And you had a similar program in Greece for Syrian refugees?
We did. So in Lesbos, Greece, we worked with HIAS. They had an operation going at a refugee camp in Lesbos. And so we rotated in lawyers across our European offices and our Middle East offices to spend there. They spent 3 weeks at a time. So in the US, we would go for 1 week at a time. But because the learning curve was a little bit steeper there, and the way that they were delivering services really required a longer commitment of time, our lawyers would go for 3 weeks at a time and spend on the ground with lawyers from HIAS delivering services to refugees in Lesbos.
Oh, and I know that the work that was particularly notable was the work with when the U.S. government decided to separate the little children from their mothers. Tell us about that.
So when we were still in the detention center, the government began to roll out the policy of separating moms from children. And we had the moms. So we were in the adult detention center dealing with women. And so we had over 80 moms who had been separated from their children. The best way for those moms to get reunited with their children would be to pass what we call a credible fear interview, which is an interview to see whether they have a credible fear of returning to their home country. They need to be prepared for that. And there are several legal questions that come in the process of that interview, and they needed some time to really be prepared so that they could tell the important parts of their story to the interviewer. And we really struggled because the moms were so distraught at having been removed from their families, from their children, that they really had a hard time focusing on their cases. And we had a really hard time getting them to think about what their legal case was in order for them to pass that interview. Then they could be released, and then they could be reunited with their children. It's a great example of when lawyers have to put their lawyer hats on, right, and get in the room and really fight for the rule of law in those moments, because they really need an advocate, and you've got to keep your wits about you because the stories are so traumatic and challenging. Because we saw so many of them at our facility, we were able to do an affidavit in support of the litigation that went forward that challenged the separation of moms and kids. And our affidavit was an important part in the court's assessment because we really could talk about a large number of moms and what their experiences were in being separated from their children.
Well, we'll come back to that in a second. Yasmin, the one thing, and let me pick up on that, just using the Jones Day as an example. We have happily an incredibly diverse set of lawyers around the world, and not least here in North America, and in every sense, gender, race, etc. So that I think that's been one of the strengths of the firm in terms of its ability to deliver what's our day jobs and all the nonprofit type work that we do. I know you've spent a lifetime thinking about issues of diversity, so I'll just turn the microphone over to you.
Sure. Thanks very much. And it was fascinating to hear about some of the work that Jones Day is doing. Kudos to the firm for getting 1,000 lawyers to collaborate on this work. what I'd like to talk about is systemic racism, and then also the whole concept around culture, because we saw that in Jeff's comments and we saw that in Laura's comments, how important culture is to an organization. And maybe I can start with the whole question around what does systemic racism look like, and why is it so difficult for organizations to admit to systemic racism? And then we'll speak to culture. But perhaps the best way for me to explain systemic racism is by sharing a story. In November 2019, and this was before COVID took over all our lives, and before we all witnessed the murder of Mr. George Floyd, I was working from home and I thought, okay, I'll take a short break and I'll catch up on the news. So I turned on the CBC, which for those who are from outside Canada, is Canada's version of the BBC. And I was sickened by the image on the screen. It was a drawing which appeared to have been done by a young child. And in the drawing, there were stick figures standing around outdoors. But the focus of the drawing was on a brown man who was pinned down by the foot of a white policeman who had a gun drawn. Across from the first policeman was another policeman, and he was getting his truncheon ready to beat the brown man pinned to the ground. The caption read, "My dad is my hero," with an arrow pointing to the white policeman who was ready with the truncheon to beat the man pinned to the ground, ready to strike. Well, for someone living in Canada, it was shocking to learn that that image had been posted on Facebook by a retired policeman from the Durham Regional Police Force. Durham is a region outside of Toronto. The Facebook group was called Durham Regional Police Friends, and the post had garnered several likes. Now, many of us in Canada pride ourselves in us being at the forefront of being a diverse community and inclusive community. We have become more and more aware of the challenges that the Black community face, the Indigenous community face, and some of the struggles through the work of Black Lives Matter, and Idle No More organizations that are very active. But certainly I know when I saw that image, I was struck by how graphic it was, and how much it was clearly seemed to have been drawn by a young child, and yet it was this really violent depiction. So does this mean, if you step back, does this mean that there were bad apples in the Durham Regional Police Force? Yes, of course. But would it be fair or correct to say that everyone or most of the Durham Regional Police Force is racist? Well, I don't know anyone who's in the police force there, but I would say that's likely not the case. What was interesting is the leadership's response, specifically the police chief, and it was on point for someone who is committed to diversity and inclusion. He publicly apologized. He called the image repulsive. He talked about the impact to his own members, to his own employees, and the community. He had the post removed. He sent out a memo saying anyone sharing such content would be disciplined to the fullest extent. Chief Martin also talked about all the effort that had been put into building trust within the membership and the community. His message was clear. This is not representative of whom we are trying to become. He understood the work involved in eliminating systemic racism. You know, Jeff, when he started his remarks, talked about how the work that's involved in ethics, the work that's involved in diversity is hard work. But so often, unlike the police chief, leaders deny that their organizations are systemically racist. Their first reaction is to say, this was due to a few bad apples who are no longer here, who've been fired, etc. But they don't get to the bottom of why those few rotten apples were allowed to stay for so long, and in many cases to thrive, because that would be admitting that the system is rotten, not simply a few individuals. And it's important to recognize that systemic racism doesn't mean everyone in the organization is racist, but it does mean that the system needs fixing. And fixing systemic racism is hard work.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, and I believe what you're really saying is we have to sort of confront it. And obviously, in this case, with your example, we did. And we, of course, with the whole Black Lives Movement matter, saw this in spades here in the US. And let's admit that not everybody's with the program because they think criticizing individuals is somehow criticizing the entire department or what have you. But Laura, that was the other thing I thought might be useful to talk about is if I know the effort that's ongoing that you must be involved with too, with respect to trying to bring all the parties together in Minneapolis.
Yes, so after the murder of George Floyd, the firm established, again, at the direction of our managing partner, a task force we call the Constitutional Policing and Civil Justice Reform Initiative. And we're working in a variety of cities in LA and Chicago and Pittsburgh, but our biggest work is in Minneapolis. The former US Attorney for the state of Minnesota is a partner at Jones Day, and he's a central player in the city in Minneapolis. And through his work and contacts, we've had a leadership role in bringing together a lot of different groups to work on police reform in the city. And that includes the key business leaders that are in town who are all really invested in having a safe city, but also a city that respects constitutional rights and civil rights. And so they've been really engaged, as well as the nonprofit and NGO community, the religious community, and we've been working with the police chief. We've brought in a couple of expert police officer chiefs from other jurisdictions who are advising and helping as we navigate the way. And working with the city as well. And so we've really been working to bring all the different important facets together who all play a part and are really the key leaders within the community, the stakeholders in the community, to all come to the table together and really work in one common direction of achieving some types of reform in the system in Minneapolis. As you may know, Minneapolis had all the right rules in place, and yet they still had the murder of George Floyd. And so that city is really coming to a reckoning of how do we get to a more cultural change in our policing and what we want from policing and what kind of leadership we want and how we want the police to interact with our communities. And so they really are, I think, going to be a leader for the United States as we think about these issues going forward.
And that's coming back to you, Yasmin. I think one theme of this session all day is collaboration, and collaboration is everything from technology and putting together new vaccines to what Laura has described. And the one thing I often say is every once in a while you end up in one of these so-called rule of law conferences, and a bunch of people are sitting around in a fancy conference room wringing their hands about rule of law. And I think that some of the work that at least we've tried to do is on the front lines. And Laura's example is the best one, with tents on the river. But getting out into the world this morning, the session we talked about, we spent a lot of time actually doing training in the dusty byways of African cities, because that's where the need is. But from your experience with the work you do with diversity, how are you able to engage other stakeholders to promote that which you have just finished describing a minute ago?
I'd say probably, in all my years working in this field, and I used to be the vice president in charge of diversity and inclusion for Bank of Montreal, which is one of the largest banks in Canada. And that gave me a forefront view on diversity and inclusion across the country, and opportunities also to look at it abroad. And I'd say probably the one sort of defining characteristic, if there's one thing that sort of sets the stage for success in diversity and inclusion, it's using the power of the CEO office. And you see this, for example, if I think many of us, in fact, probably more than likely all of us, watched the inauguration yesterday of President Biden in the United States. And it was very, very clear that his mandate, if you're going to be part of his team, you're going to be somebody who is focused on ensuring diversity and inclusion. There's if you look at the people that he's picked to work with him, if you look at even the remarks that he's made, and his whole approach to pre-running for president and since being elected to office, is very, very clear that he is a huge advocate for diversity and inclusion. And what I've seen across the board is if you have a CEO that's committed and is determined to making change, they are able, through the power of their office, to get the entire organization to collaborate and external stakeholders to collaborate as well. I know one of the things that Bank of Montreal did was introduce into its contracts with suppliers the requirement to share information on diversity and inclusion. What were they doing to embed and advocate for diversity and inclusion in their organizations? And I've actually been hired on a consultancy basis to help organizations meet mandates that other organizations have put on them as suppliers. So there's this ripple effect and this collaborative effect that really is generated by one person. He or she, the CEO, can actually drive change that is across the organization. And when you look at something like systemic racism, it isn't just about training. We've all seen how training is a piece, but certainly not the answer to the challenges you have on diversity and inclusion. It has to be embedded in the organization. It has to be, you have to look at who you're hiring, how you're hiring, where you're hiring from. You have to look at how you're training and promoting. You have to assign, you look at how you assign opportunities to learn, how you assign opportunities to develop, how you communicate. It could even be the artwork on your walls. Creating a culture which is inclusive is not easy, but the payoff is huge.
No,
the reward is.
That's so right. It's interesting. I mean, probably we're all showing our political stripes here, but yep, when you have the president or the CEO and Laura describing our managing partner, really make a very clear statement about objective, that goes a long ways. I'm reminded I was with an energy company in California as the general counsel and chief environmental officer, but it was sort of the same thing there when I said, okay, we're going to go clean beaches this weekend, obviously with appropriate planning. I'd get 1,500 people up and down the coast of California into Mexico who would come along, and we would all spend half a day, 3/4 of a day doing that. And my daughters and I would always go, and I think it was kind of the example of it which really helped. And the same thing, we used to be a company with essentially many fossil fuel type power plants and all. And then there was a decision made with, by the way, economic consequences, saying, okay, you know what, we're going to get out of this stuff and we're going to convert to being a renewable energy company. And because the leadership was there, it worked. Laura, what, I must say that it must be very emotional to be working with mothers separated from their single-digit-year-old children. And I would think it's both very emotional, but also very rewarding because you were actually helping people in the most important aspects of their life. What are some examples of that?
There's so many stories from the families that we've helped. There's two that come to mind. One is when we first came to the radio, I told you there were all these women that wanted lawyers. And when we would talk to them after we started meeting with them, they told us over and over again that before we got there, they would sit in they would be in these big dorm rooms. There's 50 of them to a dorm room, and they would be stuck in that dorm room for 23 hours a day. They got out 1 hour a day if the weather was nice enough to be outside. And so they would sit in there at night, and all of them would hold hands and pray that God would send them angels. And then one day all these lawyers showed up, and they saw us as angels coming to help them because they just didn't have any link to the outside. They didn't understand what was happening to them. They didn't know what their path forward was. And so that was one of those moments where you really reflect back and think, we're making a difference. And even if it's not a huge systemic change for those individual women, we're transforming their lives. When we were doing migrant protection protocols, the MPP, while people were remaining in Mexico, they would have their trials in these tent courts. And if we won, they actually got released that day, which was really incredibly exciting. So they would just come out of the tent court and walk over to the hotel where our office was just right next to the tent courts. And we represented a bunch of families. And so I remember we were sitting we got in a hotel room for this family, and they were waiting until the next day when they would be able to be they would go take a plane to wherever their family was in the US. And these two little girls, they were like 7 and 9, they were rolling around the floor, pinching each other. And their mom looked at us and said, what they're saying, because they didn't understand them, what they were saying was, pinch me, is it real? Are we here? Are we safe? Are we in America? And at that moment, you know, it's those like few moments where you just burst into tears, because you realize the impact is not just on the individual person that you represented, the parents, it's on their children, it's on their family members, it's treating them with respect and showing them that somebody in the United States cares about them, and what they take that, you know, how they take that into the communities and into the life that they're going to build in the United States. It changes the lawyers that represented them or that came down and met with them, who see immigrants in a totally different light now, and are really transformed in their views about immigration and maybe humanity in certain respects. And then they go back home and they tell their churches and their book clubs and all their friends. And so the ripple effect of those individual stories are multiplied. And so it's really extraordinary.
That's so, you know, that's so absolutely wonderful. And, you know, occasionally when we are so distressed about policies that our governments may be promoting, it's nice to know that there's a silver lining. And I think, Yasmin, to turn the question over to you, you know, you read about the fact that some of the people who have racist views are the people who actually don't interact with people of other colors and races. And when they do, they realize, as all of us know only too well, we're just all people in the end, right? Because we, in our case, have the best food, but that aside, we're all very similar otherwise. How has that worked with your consulting work and your other work on behalf of diversity in large institutions in Canada?
I know there have been studies, certainly, that have looked at, for example, Islamophobia, and they found, interestingly enough, that in Canada, these studies have found that if you have had contact with Muslims and if, you know, they're part of kind of your interactions in daily lives, you are less likely to have Islamophobia than if you've had absolutely no contact with them at all. And I've always found that fascinating on how you could have never had an interaction with someone and still have this sort of perception of them and this negative perception of them. And some of it, I have to say, has to be media-based. You know, when you look at what shows up, for example, if we talk about Islamophobia and you look at kind of what shows up on the news, a lot of times you would think that's all there is in those countries. There's just this violence and this daily sort of ongoing bombs blowing and that sort of thing. And you don't see the aspect, the sort of 99% of life that doesn't involve any of that, where people are listening to poetry, going to the park, reading, leading their daily lives. And there's this sort of news, I guess, to make it news is all about the anomaly, something that isn't part of regular life, and that's your focus. But it isn't about what people's everyday lives is like, what they experience on a regular basis. And it is, you know, often, I think one of the things that this pandemic has done, but one of the things that in the future, I hope, the more you travel, the more I think it opens up your mind, and the more I think you change your perspectives. I remember talking to Laura, and she was saying, you know, when the lawyers got engaged in some of this work with the migrants, what they found was all these negative impressions of what a caravan is, you know, and caravan is made up of all these people who are violent and who are coming to do harm. And suddenly you realize, no, that isn't the case at all. These are human beings just like you and I who are trying to find a better life for their children, for their families. These are women and children looking to improve their circumstances. These are families looking for the promise that America has, the promise that Canada has, the promise that, you know, Javade, you and I have had the benefit of experiencing, you know, born somewhere else, but moving to the countries that we're in now, that are home now, and that have embraced us and that we in turn have embraced. So I think there's a huge opportunity for learning that happens. I strongly believe that there's a role that media can play in sharing some of these stories, sharing some of the human life, so that you see, well, what you know, you look at a country that's war-torn, that's like Iraq or Syria, and if you're aware of their history and their culture and some of the gifts that they've made for humanity, some of the contributions that they've made to science, I would hazard that if you picked a regular American high school student or a Canadian high school student, chances are they would have no awareness whatsoever of these contributions. And I think that is such a loss. I think there's a huge opportunity for education to broaden, especially programs like the IB curriculum, where it's called the International Baccalaureate education program. There's a huge opportunity to embrace knowledge. I grew up in Tanzania learning about British history. I never learned about African history.
Isn't that? But no, you're so right. You're so right. I mean, the whole subject of the missing sort of pieces of history that are not taught in, and I think we have a particular problem in North America, unfortunately, with some curriculum. But Laura, just to kind of start to wrap this up, I mean, I know well, but we won't spend too much time on it. All the work we do in Africa in terms of, training judges and lawyers and training, as we say in the colloquial language, people in government and people in state-owned enterprises, how not to get ripped off by people like me sitting across the table from them. So, teaching skills and, working in slum schools and the whole range of stuff, which I'm very grateful the firm sponsors. What about other parts, other programs in North America that you might briefly touch on that we do in collaboration with some of our clients, lawyers who also want to, do good things?
So I think one of the other large areas where our corporate clients have been really engaged is human trafficking. They face it both from a business perspective of their supply chains and if their financial institutions of money coming through their financial institutions, and they care about it from a personal level. And so we've had a lot of interest from our clients in getting engaged in the issue, and it's such a complex issue. It really requires some out-of-the-box types of thinking and solutions. And so we're involved in several collaborations with the financial institutions and NGOs in the space to start figuring out how to trace money and how to look for people that are engaged in human trafficking through the financial institutions. We also are looking at there's a lot of online sexual exploitation of children in other countries. And so creating remedies for them in the United States and finding lawyers willing to take those and working with our corporate clients to identify those. A lot of on the ground opportunities to serve survivors of trafficking. And so it's a space where our corporate clients have both for institutional reasons and for personal reasons really want to be involved. And we found some great partnerships.
Wonderful, obviously wonderful objectives. I think just to conclude here, the message, it seems to me, is to pick up on Jeff's point about culture. There's so many ways to help change the culture, and some of it is sort of chipping away in many different ways and places. There's nothing like actually being on the front lines and fixing it, but equally, it's as you said, Yasmin, it's training, but that's only one piece of it. But I think that it's sort of the collective collaboration of effort at the macro level and at the individual level, which one can hope will lead us to greater ethics, greater diversity, and ultimately greater, more responsible institutions, whether they are national governments or small businesses. And I think, Bashir, with that, we will stop talking here, or we will keep going for the rest of the afternoon.
Thank you very much, Javed. That was very, very interesting. So big thank you to Javed. You managed 2 of the sessions. Laura, thank you very much. That was very interesting, insightful, as did Yasmin. So everybody brought different perspective. That was fantastic. So big thank you to all of you and you can stay on, just mute the camera off and hide yourself, and you can remain for the balance of the thing. So thank you very much. I'll chat with you guys. It was
been a pleasure.
Thanks. So what I will do is, my friend